But it's also true that with the Industrial Revolution came a huge growth in population. Birth rates went up as people were richer, mortality went down as people were better at controlling disease and improving nutrition. And so the population of European countries absolutely skyrocketed in the 19th century. Indeed, from the late 18th century to the 20th century, we saw a boom primarily in the population of Europe that allowed Europeans to go out and settle the country we're in now, the United States, of course, but also large parts of Latin America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. It's hard to recall this, but as late as 1913, Europe, including Russia, had more people than China. The rise of China into a demographic megastate is relatively recent. Europe was the dominant source of population growth and economic growth for the first 200 years after the Industrial Revolution. And European countries, enjoying a combination of rapid population increase and rapid productivity gains, grew far richer than other parts of the world. In 1980, just 30 years ago, China was still struggling to emerge from the chaos of the great cultural proletarian revolution. It was astonishingly poor. Italy alone had twice the gross domestic product of all of China. The Netherlands had a greater GDP than Indonesia. Things have changed enormously in the last 30 years. Rich people decided that children were now something of a luxury that they would prefer to have less of. And birth rates in the wealthy countries, particularly Europe and Japan, but also to some degree the US and Canada, have fallen greatly from their levels in the 60s and 70s. Many European countries are actually at less than replacement rate. That is, without migration, their population will fall. And it's already started in some countries. Germany's population today is actually less than it was 5 years ago. Now, this is a huge turning point. The working age population of European countries, that is, the population aged 15 to 65, was actually growing steadily from 1950 all the way up to 2005 at about 1% a year. But by the early 2000s, the decision of Europeans to have fewer children, plus the great gains in lifespan that we've enjoyed, have meant that the proportion of older people started to increase more than they were replaced by youngsters. And even with migration at current levels, the labor force in European countries as a whole has started its decline and is projected to keep declining for another 30 or 40 years to the point where by 2050, the labor force in European countries will be back to where it was in 1950. Now that's the extreme case, or Japan, I would say, is even more extreme. We in the United States, been more open to immigration. We've had higher birth rates, but even so, we had a large baby boom in the 1960s and 70s. Those individuals are now getting older. They're having fewer children. And the result is that even in the United States and Canada, the fraction of the population over age 60 is going to grow. And in absolute numbers, the gain is huge. We expect that the number of individuals over age 60 in the United States is about 70 million people today. That will increase to 140 million by 2050. It will double, and at that point it will be nearly a third of the population. Now, I'll come back to some of the implications of that aging in a minute. First, I want to point out the economic consequences of this. Countries where the labor force is declining will have a hard time keeping their economies growing. Because after all, economic output is the result of two factors: how many people are working and how productive they are. So even if productivity grows, a decline in the labor force means that that productivity growth is offset. It's very unlikely that the rich country economies will be growing at more than 2 or 3% for the next few decades as their populations kind of stabilize. On the other hand, developing countries, they're where Europe was in the 19th century. They're enjoying rapid population growth, even though that growth rate is slowing down in countries like China, Brazil, Indonesia. They still have what we call demographic momentum. That is, if a large number of young women were born 20 or 30 years ago, as those women move through their childbearing years, they in turn will give birth to a large cohort of youngsters. And it therefore takes about 30 years for a decline in fertility to work its way through the population and bring population growth rates down. So we have countries like China, India, that are growing rapidly in population, but they've also started to industrialize. Their economic growth rates and productivity are taking off at the same time. That is how they've been able to enjoy growth rates of 5%, in the case of China, 10% per year. Now, that doesn't mean that China is all of a sudden going to replace the West as the world's dominant economy. If you look at the domination that Europe achieved, it's astonishing. By the end of World War II, almost 70% of global economic output was produced by Europe, North America, and Japan. 70%. The rest of the world was poor to a degree where they hardly mattered in global economic concerns. No region of the world is going to duplicate that. However, the portion of global economic output coming from the West has been declining, from about 70% in the 1950s to about 50% today, and probably declining to around 30% by 2050. So the degree to which we in the West can enjoy calling the shots in the world economy is disappearing rapidly. By 2050, the West will be one economically developed region of the world, but jostling with other communities that are also increasing their consumption. In fact, already just this year, China surpassed the United States as the world's leading market for new automobiles. This came a little bit ahead of schedule due to the recession in this country being worse than we expected, but still, that's just a harbinger. It's anticipated that in the next 30 years, the middle class in developing countries will grow to the point where between 2030 and 2040, there should be over 1 billion middle-class consumers outside of Western Europe and the US. Over 1 billion, that's more than the total population of Europe, the United States, and Japan combined. So the motor of economic growth around the world is going to be shifting to the countries like Brazil, Mexico, China, India, and not only them. Countries in Africa, like Ethiopia, which is expected to go from 80 to 150 million people by next century. Nigeria, which may double from 150 million to 300 million today. These countries are just starting to get on track for economic growth. They're starting to invest in fertilizer, in export industries. They're somewhat like China was in 1980, or South Korea was in the 1960s. They're just at the beginning of what could be a great run of prosperity that will raise their significance in the world. Now, as I said, at the same time that these countries are young, dynamic, and growing, we have to face the fact that our population is aging, becoming more mature, I'd like to say. And that's a good thing. That's what we want. We've invested heavily in increasing our life expectancies and building supports for us. So it's great that more and more people are surviving to be 60, 80, even 100. However, this is something radically new in human history. The world has never seen societies in which 30, even 40% of the population, as is expected for South Korea and Japan, will be over 60 years old. Now, that is going to be a society with a lot of accumulated wisdom and experience, but those are societies in which the normal flow of workers to the entry-level labor market, normal flow of youthful energy, innovation, is going to be depressed. Let's face it, most of the great innovations in science and engineering do tend to come from people often before age 40. Now, a balanced age structure tends to have a reasonable number of young people, old people, working people. We say that countries like China or like the United States in the late 20th century that had a baby boom moving through the most productive years, that is, when there's a bulge in the population age from, say, 30 to 50, when people are at their most productive, that's great for the economy. I mean, that's a real boost. But when those people start to move into their 50s and 60s, you don't have the same gains in education and experience. The United States, after all, Europe, populations are fully literate. About 40% are college educated. We may be able to increase that to 60%.